How did the deadliest airline in history stay hidden for so long? Because in the Soviet Union, control didn't end at the border. It reached 30,000 feet. When the Chernobyl reactor exploded, the world saw what the USSR feared most: exposure. Not fallout, but the loss of control over the story. Aeroflot was the crown jewel of Soviet aviation. Its name was painted across continents, its reach broke records, its image pure progress. But behind the symbols were black boxes no one ever opened. More than 8,000 passengers died aboard its planes. Most their stories never reached the ground. This isn't just a story about planes, it's about the quiet cost of control and the people erased to protect it. At its peak, Aeroflot was the largest airline in the world. It flew more passengers than any carrier in the world, and it operated over 10,000 aircraft. Its routes stretched from East Berlin to the Arctic Circle. On paper, it looked unstoppable, a Soviet marvel connecting 11 time zones. But beneath the surface, something else was flying. Flight crews pushed past exhaustion, planes took off missing key parts, some landed just barely. Others never made it back. One flight ended with a 15-year-old boy in the captain's seat and 75 people buried in the Siberian hillside. On others, the crew followed standard checklists, while KGB agents took notes from the back row. Aeroflot was the government's tool for transport, for surveillance, for control. And when the disasters happened, and they did, no one talked. The wreckage disappeared, reports were rewritten. To the outside world, it was a miracle of Soviet progress. To those on board, it was a risk you didn't get to question. It all began with a single plane, a single mission, and one goal: to make the Soviet skies untouchable. What followed would become the biggest mystery commercial aviation had ever seen, until it finally crashed into the truth. In 1923, a small wooden biplane lifted off from Moscow and flew east to Nizhny Novgorod. It was loud, slow, and barely airworthy. But for the Soviet Union, it marked the beginning of something far bigger. That same year, the Soviet government launched Dobroyot, a state-run aviation service designed to connect the vast Soviet territory. It would later be renamed Aeroflot. The airline grew fast. It didn't just move passengers, it carried doctors, mail, supplies, even livestock. It flew not for comfort or commerce, but for command. By the 1930s, Aeroflot had become a national symbol. Posters showed heroic pilots soaring above the tundra. Films glorified its reach. For the Soviet state, it was proof that socialism could fly. But beneath the image, the operation struggled. Pilots often lacked proper training, weather reports were unreliable, navigation systems were crude, runways were little more than flattened ground. And the pressure to fly, no matter the risk, was constant. Still, expansion never slowed. In 1956, it flew over 1 million passengers. 10 years later, 20 million. By the 1970s, Aeroflot was operating nearly 5,000 flights a day across more than 3,000 destinations, with a fleet of almost 10,000 aircraft. It had its own weather network, flight schools, and rescue teams. It was an empire in the sky. But that empire ran on strain. Planes were overworked, parts were reused, radios failed mid-flight, and flight schedules were packed beyond capacity. When something went wrong, the response wasn't investigation, it was silence. Failures weren't addressed, they were absorbed. By the end of the 1970s, Aeroflot was flying more people than any airline on Earth. But quantity didn't mean safety. And without outside pressure or competition, even the worst mistakes went unchallenged. In the next decade, those mistakes would turn deadly, at a scale the system couldn't handle, and history nearly forgot. In the early hours of March 1979, a Tu-104 jet lifted off from Moscow on a routine training flight. It didn't last long. Just minutes after takeoff, the plane stalled. The crew had overloaded it with cargo and personnel, including 17 high-ranking Soviet officers. The pilots lost control, the aircraft crashed and exploded just outside the city. All 58 people on board were killed. There was no news report, no national funeral, the wreckage was cleared, and the event was erased from the official record. It wasn't an isolated case. On May 5, 1972, Aeroflot Flight 1491 was en route from Moscow to Kharkiv. A structural failure in the tail section caused the aircraft to break apart mid-air. It disintegrated before the crew could even radio for help. The crash killed 118 people, one of the worst aviation disasters in Soviet history. But the Soviet press never mentioned it. And then there was Flight 331, approaching the city of Lviv in 1985. Thick fog, low visibility, faulty runway lights. The pilots descended too fast, unaware they were well below the proper glide path. The plane hit a power line, slammed into the ground, and exploded on impact. Dozens died instantly. Survivors were pulled from the burning wreckage by local visitors, many with third-degree burns. No official investigation was ever released. The press referred to it as a hard landing. These were warnings ignored again and again. Pilots were flying old, overworked planes with broken instruments and unreliable gauges. Weather conditions were often extreme. Crews were pushed to stay on schedule, even if it meant flying without a clear plan. And when something went wrong, the first concern wasn't safety, it was secrecy. The Soviet state controlled all media. To preserve the image of strength, failure couldn't be seen. Acknowledging a crash meant admitting a flaw in Soviet engineering, training, or leadership. So, crashes were covered up, not just to avoid panic, but to protect the illusion of perfection. If a crash didn't involve foreigners or happen in front of international witnesses, it simply didn't exist. Reports were locked away. Blame was handled internally. In some cases, families weren't even told where their loved ones had died. Black box data was never made public. Some survivors were instructed to remain silent. Others weren't believed. Even air traffic controllers were warned. If something happened, say nothing. There were so many incidents that Soviet authorities created internal-only crash codes used to report accidents the public would never hear about. In 1981, a leaked audit from the Ministry of Civil Aviation confirmed what insiders already knew. Dozens of crashes could have been prevented. Failure, mechanical problems, rush landings, it was all written down. But nothing changed. The Aeroflot brand mattered more than the truth. It stood for Soviet power, and power wasn't allowed to fail. But safety wasn't the only thing being managed behind closed doors. Most people flying had no idea that on many routes someone else was on board, watching, listening, and reporting. The Soviet Union had another force in the skies. No uniforms, no flight plans, no passenger records. The KGB was always on board. Aeroflot gave the Soviet Union something no other airline could: reach across borders, across republics, and deep into people's lives. Officially, it was a civilian carrier. In reality, it was wired into the Soviet military. Many of its planes were trained by the Air Force. Its aircraft were dual-purpose, ready to move passengers or military hardware, depending on what the Kremlin required. The Ilyushin Il-76 flew scheduled Aeroflot routes. It also dropped paratroopers, hauled tanks, and supplied forward bases. Some flights touched down in closed cities, secret military zones that didn't appear on maps. Civilians couldn't enter, but Aeroflot could. These were listed on public schedules. Crews were told their destinations only hours before takeoff. Why the secrecy, and what were they carrying? Inside the cabin, surveillance was routine. On certain flights, undercover observers sat among passengers, posing as travelers or junior crew. On international routes, their presence was nearly guaranteed. Flight attendants were trained to spot and report political conversations, contact with foreigners, even offhand complaints about the government. One stewardess recalled being questioned by officials, not about the storm she'd radioed in, but about a passenger's idle comment she'd overheard in the aisle. And it didn't stop with passengers. Pilots and flight engineers could be quietly recruited as informants, sometimes without knowing who they were really reporting to. One retired Aeroflot captain later said flight logs were sometimes intercepted or edited before investigators ever saw them. Even the cargo raised questions. Flights routinely carried sealed containers with cryptic internal codes. No descriptions, no manifests, the destinations, remote bases. During the Civil War, Western analysts tracked strange Aeroflot flight paths, planes stopped at military hubs, flying back empty, or traveling under radio silence. What kind of airline flies blind across hostile airspace and doesn't file a return? Yes, Aeroflot moved people, but it also moved encrypted gear, surveillance equipment, and occasionally materials tied to chemical research, none of it declared. Inside the Soviet Union, Aeroflot was untouchable. It served the party, it served the military, and when needed, it served the shadows. But in the final years, the cracks began to show. Control was slipping, borders were breaking, and Aeroflot's perfect cover was about to be exposed. In the early 1990s, the Soviet Union was gone, but Aeroflot was still flying. It had been rebranded to Aeroflot Russian International Airlines, a transitional version of the old state carrier trying to modernize under a new flag. But much of the infrastructure, training, and culture was still rooted in Soviet-era habits. Then came a flight that exposed everything. March 23, 1994, Aeroflot Flight 593 departed from Moscow, headed for Hong Kong. On board, 75 people, including crew and passengers from 9 countries. The aircraft was an Airbus A310, a Western-made plane leased by Aeroflot as part of its post-Soviet modernization push. It was new, clean, equipped with advanced autopilot systems, but the problem wasn't the machine. The captain, Yaroslav Kudrinsky, was a respected pilot, former military, highly experienced. He had been cleared to fly the A310 and was proud of it, and that pride, investigators later said, may have been part of what killed everyone on board. He had brought his 2 children, 15-year-old Eldar and 13-year-old Yana, into the cockpit during the flight. It wasn't allowed, but old habits die hard. For Soviet-era pilots, casual cockpit access was common, especially for family. This wasn't the first time a child sat in the captain's chair, but this time the child didn't just sit. At cruising altitude, Kudrinsky let his son take the controls. The autopilot was changed, the plane was stable. Eldar was told he could try the yoke. He did, and the system registered the input. The crew had no clue that the autopilot's lateral control partially disengaged, specifically the roll channel. That meant the aircraft began banking to the right, responding to the boy's touch. Slowly, gradually, then dangerously. At first, no one noticed. Then, the plane kept tilting. The bank angle increased past 45 degrees. The autopilot disengaged fully, and the aircraft entered a steep descending turn. By the time the crew realized what was happening, the A310 had already lost too much altitude. The first officer tried to pull up. The captain took back control. But the descent was too deep, the airspeed too fast, the terrain too close. At 00:58 local time, Flight 593 slammed into a mountain in the Kuznetsk-Alatau range of southern Siberia. The plane was completely destroyed. All 75 people died. For days, the cause was a mystery. There was no distress call, no radar warning, no weather problem. Then, investigators opened the cockpit voice recorder and heard voices they weren't expecting. Children. The black box revealed every moment. The child in the seat, the autopilot disengaging, the slow spiral into disaster. When the findings were released, they shocked the world. Not because of sabotage, not because of faulty equipment, but because of a decision, a single casual act of overconfidence. The crash became a symbol of Aeroflot's growing pains, a post-Soviet airline flying modern Western jets with a Soviet-era culture still in the cockpit. Inside Russia, officials insisted that safety reforms were underway, but around the world, one question echoed. If this could happen once, how many other times had it nearly happened without a recorder to catch it? The Aeroflot files were just one door that opened, but behind them are thousands more. Chemical leaks no one reported, medical trials no one consented to, entire industries built on silence and protected by it. How many names were buried with the paperwork? How many truths were never meant to surface? The Soviet Union is gone, but the systems it perfected, the ones that erase, conceal, and move on, still exist. And one day, someone will ask the same questions we asked of Aeroflot. What really happened? Who knew? And how long were they willing to keep it quiet?